oh my god, my previous video, thank you so much for the likes, the comments, the follows, hi new people, and just generally I didn't expect a video on such a heavy subject that I presented just basically off the cuff to do as well as it did. So thank you from the bottom of my little black heart. My name is Faith Roswell and I teach psychological self-defense. I'm also terrified of talking on camera. So here I am doing videos to get myself more comfortable talking about this kind of thing, talking about this subject. Because I've got a story today that is going to blow your mind and possibly even make you change your mind. Someone commented saying that even the worst scumbag deserves a fair trial. So, with that being said, I want to ask you 3 questions, okay, and I want you to think about these. Number 1, is vigilante justice ever okay? Is it ever okay to take the law into your own hands? Number 2, if you answer no, is there any situation, anything you can think of that would change your mind? What would you have to endure? What would push you to finally snap? And number 3, I want to know at the end, have you changed your mind? So I have got a tale to tell you about the town bully. And that's all they dared to call this man, because he was that scary. Now, he looked like Tony Soprano if he was wearing an Elvis wig. His name was Ken Rex McElroy, and he terrified a town for decades until one day he didn't. Ken was born in 1934, and this is an age before contraception was readily available, so he was actually the number 15 out of 16 children. His parents were farmers, and they were called Tony and Mabel, and they worked between like Kansas, the Ozarks, sort of a farming kind of area of the US, until they moved to this little farming town in Missouri, and it's called Skidmore. Now, Skidmore at the time was about 450 people when Ken was growing up, and it was an even smaller town than it seemed. Ken's family, that's what, 18 people. You've got other families, massive farming families, you know, with other huge amounts of people. So actually, you know, you think 450 people, that's a handful of families, really. So everybody knew each other. It was very insular, but it was this bustling, thriving place. You know, it had an opera house, it had a hairdresser, they had a grocer called Beau and a cafe called Mum's. This was a small town where people knew each other, you know. Now, Skidmore is now known for some seriously messed up crimes, including this one. But, you know, at the time Ken was growing up, the most famous thing about Skidmore was its annual agricultural and pumpkin festival called the Pumpkin Festival. So I grew up in a small village just outside a small town. I grew up before everybody had mobile phones, and let me tell you, the annual craft fair and agricultural festival was the highlight of everybody's year, even the pre-teens. I can pretty much guarantee you that the childhood Ken, this would have been like the highlight of his entire year. Now, most sources that I've found have said that his childhood was relatively normal, but there was this one thing that happened to him. And I have looked at different sources. Most people think he fell off a hay wagon as a child, and he had such an injury to his skull that he needed a metal plate. Now, other sources have said that later in life, like late teens, mid-teens, he was working on a construction site and his head got hit by a concrete or a metal beam. The common consensus is hay wagon. Anyway, head injury, a serious one. The family denies that he has this metal plate. The family, as far as we know, the family have never admitted that this actually happened, but as far as we know, clearly something must have happened to him. It is possible that Ken had some degree of brain damage, but there are people all over the world with brain damage that don't do what Ken did. Now, you'd think that if this nice young boy from your neighbourhood had this awful accident and then suddenly like that, the personality drastically changed, you'd know about it. It would be kind of the talk of the village. But no one seems to have this kind of story about Ken. No one seems to have said, this was a really nice boy and then, well, you know what happened to him. Now, Ken wasn't doing very well in school. He kept getting held back a year, so, you know, obviously as everybody else in school was meeting his class, he was growing taller and taller and taller in the class until he was head and shoulders above everybody else, and understandably he stuck out like a sore thumb, and he did not like this. He was a big guy anyway, and he started to bully people. He did the typical stealing your lunch money, shoving his weight around, and he seemed to absolutely target the people he felt were doing well. Like he seemed to be insanely jealous of the students whose families were prosperous in farming, because, you know, his parents, they weren't doing so well. Now, Ken, as a lot of kids did at that age, left school at 15, but a lot of kids that age were going to help their parents on the farm. You know, at farming families, you start to help run the family business, but no, Ken wanted to do something else, because Ken, from age 13, was already well into a life of crime. He was already, as a young teenager, he was stealing livestock, selling them at auctions. 13, he got his start. And just to put that like in some perspective, the outlaw Billy the Kid was 17. As Ken grew, older and bigger, he could not hold down a normal job. People don't just like suddenly become small-time criminals overnight. So I really want to know like what his dad did. I want to know a little bit more about his family, but it doesn't seem that his family were criminals, but who knows? So based on the reports about Ken, this little stealing, thieving kid who grew into a big stealing, thieving kid who grew into this criminalistic bully, there was nothing redeemable about Ken. As you can probably guess from, the various criminal enterprises, the guy was earning money. He was earning enough. He lived in a big house on the edge of Skidmore. He had these hunting dogs that he trained. He hunted raccoons at night. So he was earning money legitimately by, on paper, raising and selling these hunting dogs and also leasing some of the land, around where he lived. But at night, he was sneaking around in the darkness, which is where he thrived, and he was stealing livestock. Now, you would think that a small town in the US that has a lot of farmers and probably not quite as many gun regulations as now, you would expect that this thieving, rude, stealing, bullying, livestock rustling guy, you'd think these farmers would not stand for that more than like once, if that at all. But Ken was getting away with it. He was scary. He was over 6 foot tall. He weighed like over 270 pounds. And he had taught himself, or been taught, we don't know, to intimidate people. His party trick was to follow people slowly in his truck. He'd sit outside the house, staring into the window, and occasionally fire his shotgun into the air. And people took that threat seriously. Really seriously. One of the Skidmore residents said, this guy didn't yell, he didn't need to. He spoke in this quiet, low whisper, and just the threat of Ken McElroy was enough. There's one guy who knew him called Bill Everhart. He lived, they grew up in the same town, grew up together. He said Ken was not the kind of guy you'd see in the street brawling in a fist fight. No. He'd just use his gun. So in 1976, Ken accused this local farmer called Romaine Henry of spying on him. Ken followed Romaine Henry down the road in his truck, got up alongside him, bullied him, pushed him off the road. Henry stopped the truck. Ken stopped the truck. Ken got out of his truck, holding his gun, and he walked around the side, looked in at the window at Henry, raised his gun, and shot him in the stomach. Blood, guts, everything, all over the truck door behind Romaine. Ken then raises his gun again and shoots him in the head. My knowledge of guns is not spectacular. It was enough to feasibly kill him, but not enough for it to be, guaranteed like a machine gun or something straight to the head. Anyway, Romaine survived. He drove off at top speed. He managed to get himself to a hospital. And the crazy thing is, he pressed charges. The guy that had been shot in the stomach and shot in the head. Ken was charged with assault with intent to kill, but he was found not guilty. How was this guy getting away with this? He wasn't particularly smart. He didn't have a bank account. He didn't have a social security number. And by most accounts, he couldn't even read or write. All he had were handfuls of cash and a terrifying personality. But he had one more thing. Ken had a secret weapon. His secret weapon was his defense lawyer called Richard McFadden. He said, Ken was the best client I ever had. Now, defense lawyers are famous for trying to delay trials as long as physically possible as a tactic, and McFadden was very, very good at it. He was so good that there's a probability, rumour, that he was also a mob lawyer. Now, mob lawyers cost a lot, McFadden cost a lot, but of course, money wasn't a problem for Ken McElroy. He said to McFadden, I'll pay you anything you want, just keep me out of prison. So, when Ken's intimidation tactics didn't work, he got McFadden to fix it. McFadden has more lovely things to say about Ken. He said he was punctual, always said he didn't do it, paid in cash, and kept coming back. I was the only friend he had, he said. Now, as we know, Ken liked to tackle things personally and absolutely resented people more successful than him. So he probably truly resented having to get this guy in a suit to come along and solve all of his problems. And so he carried on intimidating witnesses even when he didn't need to. And that is how he got away with shooting Romaine Henry. Ken found out the names and addresses of every member of the jury. And according to the judge in the case, the jury members found rattlesnakes in their mailboxes. So for the people still thinking about vigilantism, the people that have still got those questions in their head, let me just recap again. A guy with now a decades-long rap sheet, constantly being questioned about crimes, getting away with everything, intimidating witnesses, not afraid to shoot people, not afraid to find out addresses, names, stalk people. Everybody was terrified of him. And in case you're wondering, why didn't they just call the police? Oh, they did call the police, they did. The people of Skidmore called the police so many times that the nearby town sent them a marshal who had one job. And that one job was to keep an eye on Ken McElroy. This man had a personal cop assigned to him. They knew. And it took Ken about 2 seconds to find out who this marshal was, threaten him with his gun, and when the marshal called for backup, nobody came. They refused to come. That marshal handed his badge in and quit his job the next day, and from then on, he worked selling cable TV. That is the fear that Ken McElroy inspired, even in the law. That doesn't mean there was a complete absence of people brave enough to press charges. There were still people brave enough to press charges, except the problem is they often found his truck parked outside their house, with him staring in at the window, with him sometimes shooting his gun in the air, maybe even rattlesnakes in their mailboxes, who knows? And if you think that's how he was treating the people who were planning to testify against him, it's not exactly a stretch of the imagination to think he's also threatening people into testifying for him too. Ken had a stable of witnesses that he could call on at any time to say, yeah, I was with him, yeah, he was with me. So just a quick reminder of that comment about everybody having a right to a fair trial. In theory, that sounds wonderful, but does this sound like a fair trial to you? Now, let's look at the people willing to testify for Ken. Now, Ken's whole stable of intimidated witnesses for hire included fellow hunters, so-called friends, and his wives. Wives plural. Ken was married. It seems like there are no redeeming features about this guy, and at first I was thinking, well, maybe he just had a real knack for seeming charming when he wanted to be. And maybe that's true, maybe that is true. Maybe he seemed charming and charismatic. Or maybe he just intimidated women into being with him just the same way that he intimidated an entire town and its law enforcement into allowing him to do absolutely anything he wanted. Because this guy's reputation as a womanizer started age 15. Now, I know that people got married at a younger age, so it's not actually that surprising that he married his first wife when he was 18, and the two of them moved away from Skidmore for a little bit, and I guess the whole town breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief, because at this point he was probably just a young troublemaker, off the rails, you know, young budding criminal. Maybe they thought they'd seen the last of him, but within, I think it was something like a few months, they moved back from the home they'd got in Denver, Colorado, because guess what? Ken couldn't hold down a job. Now, I assume he divorced his first wife, but who knows? He married another woman called Sharon, and by the 1960s, so this is back when Ken was in his 30s, he had more than one teenage girlfriend and wife living with him. He had like a whole harem, I can never remember how to pronounce that word, but what he had was a pack of women. He was the big man. And he found those potential girlfriends and wives by sitting in his truck outside the high school. Ken had so many wives, so many women, and so few condoms that the man ended up with about 10 children at least, with 4 different women at least. And he got another habit. Ken, in his late 30s, started following the school bus, honking his horn until the bus driver, terrified, stopped the bus, let one of the students off to go with him. And maybe you're thinking, this is one of his many children. He wants this kid to come with him, take over the family business. He doesn't want them getting an education. And remember, Ken looks down on people who he perceives to be more intelligent and more successful. He probably doesn't want that for any of his kids. He wants to be the big I am. But no. Ken was not looking for one of his children by following the school bus. Ken was looking for a wife. Ken was following the school bus because there was a 12-year-old girl on it called Trina McLeod, and Ken was obsessed with her. For Trina, starting puberty by being regularly picked off the school bus by a man who has terrorised your entire town since before you were born, that girl did not stand a chance. So Ken, in his late 30s, was raping Trina from the age of 12. And by the time she was 14, she got pregnant with his baby, dropped out of school, and she actually moved in with Ken and Alice. Now, I don't know what Trina's home life had been like. I don't know if her family knew that she was being abused. There is a possibility, and I am speculating here massively. Maybe he was on the surface offering her an escape from existing abuse. We don't know. Maybe they were a loving family and let her go with him out of fear. We do not know. 16 days after she gave birth, she and Alice tried to escape Ken. They ran to Trina's childhood home, and Ken tracked them down after just a few hours. And he took them and he dragged them back to his house, where I'm sure you know exactly what he did to them. And then he got Trina back in his truck and he drove her back to her family home, where he poured gasoline around it, set the home on fire, and shot her family dog. I bet many of you by now are saying, if this was my child, I would not care. I would have grabbed her, dragged her from that man's house, and I would have fled with just the clothes on my back. Hold that thought. Because Trina needed hospital treatment with her child. She took her baby, only a couple of weeks old, to the hospital, where the doctor got the story out of her about the arson and the rape and the abuse, everything. And Trina herself then filed rape charges against this man. Think of his history. Think of everyone that's gone up against him. This is now a 15-year-old girl filing rape charges against this man. Brave, brave girl. And Ken was charged with multiple counts of rape and child molestation. Now, to protect Trina in the run-up to the trial, she was taken into foster care, and she left with pretty much just the clothes on her back, and I think with her child as well. And she was kept secret, the location was kept secret with the foster family. And Ken tracked her down, and he sat outside that home in his truck, staring in at the window as he did. And he picked up his old tricks again, because he started following the school bus. But this time, he wasn't following the school bus for Trina. He was following the school bus to intimidate the child of the foster family, who he then threatened. He told them that if they did not give him back Trina, he would take their daughter in exchange. Now, Trina had not dropped those charges. This court case was still coming, and this threatened to be the thing that would finally take Ken down. But remember, Ken had his secret weapon. He had the diabolical brain of Richard Dick McFadden, and Dick had an idea. A wife cannot be compelled to testify against her husband in court. So if Ken divorced his current wife and married Trina, she'd be hamstrung, and I can only imagine what he did to her. Because in 1971, Ken married Trina and the charges were dropped. Imagine for a second, you've been kidnapped over and over again off your school bus from the people that are supposed to protect you by the one man that nobody can touch. And maybe it was easier for her, after so many years of abuse and trying to leave and being failed at every turn, even by the law, that it was easier to join him. And Trina became an accomplice. She would hold the gun when he threatened people. She would go with him when he intimidated people, because if she was with him, she was untouchable too. And it's kind of giving like small town Harley Quinn from the first terrible Suicide Squad movie. It's kind of giving that sort of fragility, and if she's under his protection, then she's safe too. Now, this umbrella of fear and protection in Ken's hands probably extended to the whole family, and that includes his children, which is probably why when two of Ken's daughters got into the tiniest altercation in the grocer's, they told Trina, who told Ken, and this started the feud that finally ended everything. Now, the Skidmore grocer was called Ernest Bowenkamp. His friends called him Bo, and he was married to a woman named Lois. One day, Lois accused one of Ken's daughters of taking a jawbreaker candy, one of those like really massive bubblegum things, without intending to pay for it. And the other daughter, because there were two of them together, slammed this jawbreaker candy back down into the jar, and the two of them walked off. And then Trina came in, furious at this apparent accusation of shoplifting, which Lois tried to smooth over, probably by now realising that hell is about to rain down based on who she's just pissed off. But it's too late now, it's too late, because then later in comes Ken to talk about it. And I think you know what I mean when I say talk about it. He came to intimidate them, and Bo tried to stand up for his wife, so you know he started trying to smooth things over. The two of them were saying, look, this it was just a misunderstanding, don't worry about it, it's just a candy, it's just like literally a candy, it doesn't matter, it's okay. Ken was having precisely none of it. So he offered Lois money to fight Trina. Now, Lois is an elderly lady. There's no way she's going to sit there and fight Trina. Obviously, she wasn't going to do that. So instead, Ken got in his truck and sat outside, staring in at the window as he did, firing shots occasionally into the air as he did. And that feud lasted for months. And it got to the point that they were terrified. This elderly couple were terrified. This constant level of fear is terrible for anyone's psyche. Living under that level of threat for so long does serious mental damage, and this old couple was struggling. So one day, Bo's aircon breaks. So now not only are they living under a constant level of stress, it's absolutely swelteringly hot. So he goes outside, he's called someone to come and repair the aircon, and he's outside the back of the grocer's, not the front, waiting. And at the back, hanging around, are a couple of boys. And then in drives Ken. He gets out of his truck. Bo tells Ken to leave, he's on private property. And Ken just looks at Bo, and he gives these two young boys some money, which he has a lot of, obviously, to go and get cold drinks. And then he turns back to Bo. And Ken's shot. And the bullet grazed the side of Bo's neck, causing blood loss. Fairly significant blood loss. Bo was 71 years old, and yet he survived, and Ken was again arrested and accused of attempted murder again. And again, Ken was charged with the lesser crime of assault. But somehow, Ken didn't manage to wiggle out of it this time. Ken was actually convicted of assault. After all this time, the theft and the rape and the child molestation and the assault with intent to kill and the animal cruelty, Ken was sentenced to 2 years in prison. But of course he appealed the sentence because he claimed that the 71-year-old grocer had come at him with a knife. But while waiting for this appeal to go through, along came Richard McFadden, who got him off on bond, which means, well, Ken is now waiting to be called back to court at some point for this appeal. Court proceedings take a long time. He's free. He's free in Skidmore, where McFadden told him not to go, but of course Ken didn't listen, so he's strutting around in the local tavern, driving away all the customers, because whenever he walked in, the customers walked out, waving his gun around, making threats against Bo the grocer. Now, the grocer's family and the tavern owner's family were actually friends. They tended to kind of try and protect each other. So they would use the children to send messages to each other to warn them about when Ken was in town. If one of the children turns up and says that they need paper towels, that means call the police right now. They'd written to the authorities, they'd written to the judges, they'd written to the governors, and yet this man has been able to get away with every single thing he's done for literally decades. So what do you do about a man like that? Well, there's a really, really good bit in a book called The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. It's one of my favourite books. And the main character, Quoth, talks about how the whole town treat nobles' sons. And he said they treat them just like a natural disaster. There is no natural disaster like nobles' sons. There's nothing you can do. All you have to do is grit your teeth while they go rampaging around, damaging everything. Then you take a deep breath and try and clean up the damage as best you can. And that is how the people of Skidmore had to treat Ken. They knew he was going to get off. Everybody knew he was going to get off. And then, once he got off this charge, he was going to come for Beau. On the morning of July 10th, 1981, the Skidmore townsfolk called a meeting, and it was in the American Legion Hall, right opposite the tavern where people used to drink before Ken arrived and everybody left. It's not known exactly how many people were in this hall. It's estimated between 40 and 60. We know that one person was the town sheriff, the other was the town mayor, and it's unknown what exactly they discussed, except for this one thing. The sheriff advised the town of Skidmore that they should set up a neighbourhood watch. Now, as this meeting is taking place, this rumbling starts up, and along comes this truck. It's a Chevy Silverado. That is what Ken drove, and it parked up outside the tavern. And out of it got Ken and Trina. And word reached the people inside the meeting that Ken and Trina were in town, and the meeting ended and people started to trickle out of the hall, and some of them went into the tavern. And Ken found that as he's sitting there with Trina, this tavern is starting to fill up, and people are starting to get very loud about where exactly Ken and Trina should go. Because this is probably the first time that people en masse dared to say anything to this man. And Trina, she got uncomfortable. And she said to Ken, I want to leave. So Ken finally got up, bought a 6-pack of beer, and the two of them walked into the daylight outside the tavern to find that there was a whole crowd of people standing there and staring at them in silence. And the two of them walked to the truck, and the people that were inside the tavern came out after them. No one said anything. Ken didn't acknowledge them, but there were faces in the windows of some of the local buildings all watching him and Trina. Even on the hill near the town but not in the town, there's a gas station sitting on top of the hill. They could see people standing on that hill watching. And with the people from the tavern and the people in the street, there were enough to surround the truck, the Chevy Silverado. And Ken calmly got into that truck and he started the engine and he lit a cigarette, and the window from behind him shattered and Ken's head slammed down into the steering wheel. His foot had been on the accelerator and it just starts to rev and rev and rev and rev, and the side door opens and somebody pulls Trina out of the side door of that truck, shoves her in the direction of the bank, where she runs across the road and runs into the bank, and that is where she takes refuge. And the guns keep on coming and the shooting lasts for 20 seconds from several different angles. Trina was physically safe, Trina was unharmed, but Ken was shot in the head and the neck, slumped forward over the steering wheel, his foot still revving and revving and revving, and not one person called an ambulance. Of course, Ken was dead. And if you ask anyone from Skidmore about exactly what happened, the main answer they'll give is, I wasn't there. It is hard to know exactly who shot Ken because nobody was there and nobody saw a thing, but casings from at least 2 different guns were found at the scene. Now, one shooter was standing about halfway down the street, another was standing right behind the truck. There may be more, we don't know. I can only imagine that Trina might have called an ambulance because the ambulance eventually came and police questioned about 45 people. They all said the same thing. They heard a shot, they ducked down, they didn't see anything. 3 separate grand juries and even the FBI tried to solve the murder of Ken McElroy. These people have got, mobsters to crack and criminals to give each other up, and no one in Skidmore cracked. Except one. Trina spoke up in court about what she saw that day, and she identified one person, and that was Del Clement. And Del was the owner of the tavern where Ken had walked into, where Ken used to drink, where he covered the table in $100 bills. The guy that co-owned that tavern was Del Clement, and that's who Trina said he shot him. But there was no physical evidence linking Del to the crime, and no one else had seen a thing. So Trina actually offered a $10,000 reward for any information that could lead to the identity of who killed Ken. And still no one in Skidmore came forward. And she even did an interview shortly after he had been shot at, and said that yes, it was her, yes, she did report him for rape, but no, he didn't do it. And no, he's nothing like anybody says. He's actually a really great guy. He's been fantastic to her, and no, he didn't burn her house down. That was actually faulty wiring. I am torn on this one because she clearly is traumatized. I mean, she had been this guy's prisoner since age 12. And this is at a time, you know, this happened in 1981. This is at a time when mental health care was virtually non-existent, and PTSD was thought of as, you know, that thing that happened to soldiers in the war. You know, this was not now. I am sure that after everything Trina went through in her life, she was probably deeply traumatized and needed serious psychiatric help, more than she ever got. However, Trina had very good reason to be devastated by the death of her one true love, because Richard McFadden tried to file on her behalf for a $5 million wrongful death suit, suing the town of Skidmore, Missouri. And I bet he was expecting a nice big pay packet after that, but they settled out of court with Trina getting $17,000, and she later remarried and moved out of Skidmore. Del Clement was never officially charged for the murder of Ken, and neither was anyone else. But there have been a few Skidmore residents that had a few things to say. So the postmaster, Jim Hartman, said, "I can't imagine anyone who had seen the shooting would feel any differently than they would about the people discovering penicillin. Nobody tried to hang them for finding a way to kill a germ." When reporters came to cover the case, one man said to them, "Where were you when McElroy pointed a gun in my face at 2 a.m? Tim Warren, the preacher, said, "There's a verse in the Old Testament, 'Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed,' and then made this face." One man talked to reporters about another case he'd been involved in, saying, "Where were you when the jury let him off?" saying it was a family matter. The marshal, who had been assigned one job to keep an eye on Ken, been threatened and quit to save his own life when he realised that nobody else was ever going to come and help him. His name was David Dunbar, and he said, "It's a real shame about the Silverado. That was a really nice truck." So that all happened in 1981. Ken's murder's still unsolved today, and it's probably not going to be solved. What can you do? No one saw a thing. So, talk to me. If you're someone who's changed their mind, at what point did you change your mind? And if you're someone that's like, no, he deserved a fair trial, at what point do you think he ever got a fair trial? And when I say that, I mean fair to his victims. I find this fascinating. I am a massive psychology nerd. I'm here to talk about self-defense, badass people, a little bit of strange but true. So there's going to be a lot more stories, not necessarily about vigilante justice. Sometimes it's going to be survival stories. Sometimes it's going to be this kind of moral dilemma, the stories that make you think. And I want to know, do you want to see more? Thank you so much for watching, supporting me. Stick around, and I'll see you in my next video.